Hi students, welcome back to another year in school. Today we'll be starting on the chapter 13, the nervous system. Okay, these slides is actually here to help you all learn better. It should not replace um, all your learning. You should also read your textbook, your notes, and your other materials as well. So this is what we're going to begin. To start off with, we'll be talking about sensitivity, followed by the different structures of the human nervous system, and finally in your examinations you are required to outline the pathway of examples of reflex action. Now, living things would actually respond to our environment and to our surrounding, and in this case, right, what actually helps us to actually sense all this is actually our sense organ, the skin. And on top of that, we have actually a lot of cells that will play a role in terms of transmitting all this information throughout our body. So a change in the environment that causes a reaction in our body is what we call a stimulus. Now all these keywords are very important in a sense. They will be able to, it will actually be able to cause a reaction. Alright, so an organism's reaction is what we also call a response. So a reaction to that stimulus. So let's say uh, you see a hot object and then you go and touch the hot object and then your hand actually get retracts. So what we can see is the stimulus in this case is actually the heat from the hot object, while your body response is actually your hand actually contracting away from the hot object. So what is then sensitivity? Sensitivity is the ability of the organism to be able to detect and to respond to changes in the environment. So definitely the higher your sensitivity, the faster you are able to detect and respond to this change. Whereas the lower your sensitivity, it is harder, it's your body's lower rate of actually being able to detect the change and to respond to it. So this is an example of a typical response to stimulus whereby you withdraw your hand when it is in contact with something hot, and plants need light for photosynthesis so as they can grow towards it. So if let's say you are someone who keeps a plant and you tend to put it in the environment, what you would see is that the light energy from the sun acts as the stimulus, while the plant actually growing towards the light is known as the response. So there is always that two relationship of detect and response. So in this case, the detect is the light. You detect the light, and then the response will come in through how you actually move towards it. The other one is bacteria moving towards the food sources, where the bacteria detects the food and the response is moving towards it. Similarly, if let's say a white blood cell is able to detect a foreign body, it would then slowly move towards it and actually kill off the foreign body. So what this actually shows that nervous system has a role in our human body. In a way, it helps us to actually detect any changes and be able to respond to it. So this nervous system generally is made up of many different parts, or maybe two main parts, but made up of a range of cells to actually help, specialized cells to actually help it to actually do the work. And through the nervous system, it helps to coordinate the different parts of the body through two main actions: voluntary actions and involuntary actions. So the difference between these two is that for voluntary actions, these are activities that are controlled consciously, meaning in your brain you are able to think, or you're able to control how you're going to respond to that change. For example, if let's say you see someone riding a bicycle zooming past you right in front of you, definitely you have two options. In your brain, you can have either you move forward or you can stop at your pathway. So in that sense, consciously you are able consider the response action and to actually exercise upon it. Whereas for involuntary action, this is a kind of response in which you don't have to consciously think of what you're doing, and then it will automatically do it for you. For example, can you control consciously the rate of your heart beating? Are you able to consciously control your pupil dilation or pupil constriction? So this is a few involuntary actions that you can do. Okay, we will talk more about this in the later few section. So an example of the pathway of the voluntary action, this is important in a form for examinations, where in exam you might be required to give an example of a voluntary action and to actually explain the path of how the information is being transmitted to your different sense organ or the receptors, carried out by the different sensory neurons, motor neurons and relay neurons, and finally to the effector. Now the ones that I'm going to highlight are the keywords that you must have in your answer. In the sense, there should be a response, there must be a stimulus, where in this case the cat rubs against your leg. There must be the word receptor, in a way where your body is able to detect that particular stimulus. You must have the 3 neurons, which is sensory neuron, relay neuron, and what's the other one? Motor neuron, to actually transmit the information. And finally, you must have the word effector. Effector muscles are where you actually exhibit a response. So this is how the whole flow will be like. So this is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6. So in your answer, you must have these 6 main portion to get your full mark for an essay question. So what will happen is, through the stimulus, your touch receptor will actually detect this stimulus, and then nervous impulses, which are generally like electrical impulses, are sent to your sensory neurons along your spinal cord. This information from your sensory neuron is relayed to your relay neuron to the brain. So your brain will actually be deciding what are the kind of responses you will do. And what will happen is, the brain, after taking in all this information, will start to evaluate and decide on the specific responses you would want, and therefore transmit it to the motor neuron via the relay neuron. This information will then be transmitted to the effector, which are generally your muscles, causing maybe a contraction or relaxation depending on the muscle group, and then it will bring out a response. Next, we look at the different structure of the human nervous system. Before we move into there, you may want to take the time to review what we have just gone through to have a better understanding of how the nervous system actually works as a whole. So in this case, over here, we will actually talk about what are the different components of the human nervous system. In this case, there is 2 human nervous system, which is the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. So for the central nervous system, they tend to come from the word central or center of the body, and you can see what are the main nervous system that is at the center of the body is the human brain, and also the very long spinal cord. So these are the main component of the human nervous system. Peripheral is, you can imagine the word peripheral like branching out. So what we can see is the branches, all the different branches of the nervous system radiating away from the central nervous system. They are your peripheral nervous system. And they also contain two main portions, cranial nerves and spinal nerve. Cranial nerves are basically nerves that are connected to the brain, whereas spinal nerves are those that branch out from the spinal cord. Okay. Generally, the upper part of the body is tend to be controlled by your brain and the cranial nerves, whereas the lower part of your body tends to be controlled by the spinal cord or the spinal nerves. Next, we look at the nervous tissues, which are commonly known as the neurons. So in your syllabus, there is three main types of neurons. We have your sensory neuron, we have your motor neuron, and lastly your relay neuron. Now some students may choose to write the word intermediate neurons, but in exam I would strongly suggest you to use relay. Please do not write relaying neuron. The key word here is relay neuron. So how would the whole response be actually connected? It will be connected through sensory, followed by the relay, followed by the motor. So always remember receptor, sensory, relay, motor, and effector. Where in the middle, this portion here tends to be the neurons. So they are based on these three types of neurons. It is important to understand the structure of the neurons, where all neurons have three main portions, which is the cell body, the axons, and the dendron. Okay, the cell body contains the nucleus and the cytoplasm, and generally this is the one that helps to manage the whole survival of the neuron. And for the sensory neuron, they tend to have the cell body in the middle of the whole neuron, whereas for the motor neuron and the relay neuron, it is actually positioned at a different angle. So generally, you can see this is how the three different neurons interact and connect in the human body. Definitely, there is actually not just one connecting like this, but there's multiple neurons interconnecting with one another. This is because if there is only one major nerve connecting the whole human body, should there be any cut, there will be actually your whole body will not be able to respond to any form of changes. So in this case, the one highlighted in yellow is the sensory neuron. As you can see, the cell body is in the somewhere in the middle of the cell body of the neuron. The one in red represents the relay neuron, and you can see the cell body is actually at the end of the neuron, while if you look at the motor neuron that is highlighted in green, you'll realize that the cell body is also located at the end. So one difference between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron is that the cell position of the cell body is different, where in the sensory neuron the cell body is located in the middle of the cell or the neuron, whereas the motor neuron is located, the cell body is located at the end. So when we look at this, the structure of a motor neuron, neuron transmit nervous impulses from the central nervous system to the nerve effector. So as we can remember, the central nervous system is actually either your spinal cord or your brain. And when we look at it, these are the different parts of the motor neuron, where at the ends of the cell body there is two portions. We could see that there is the middle thicker line here, and then the next one is the branches down here. So the one in blue represents the dendrites of the dendrons, and they receive nervous impulses from other neurons. In this case, it can receive the impulses from the relay neuron. It doesn't receive the impulses from the sensory neuron, as the sensory neuron is not connected to the motor neuron directly. In between, it is held in place by the relay neuron. The dendrons, on the other hand, are the nerve fibers that will transmit nervous impulses towards the cell body, and that is where we will always see that the direction of nervous impulses is always from the dendron end to the axon end. Okay, one way to remember is axon it sounds very similar to the word exit, so the nervous impulses tends to exit away in that direction. Okay, dendrites of the axon tends to be also very, very small, so something like this. Okay, so these are the axons, the dendrites of the axons. The motor neurons of the cell body is also irregular in shape, as you can see at this portion over here, and that the axons are nerve fibers that carry impulses away from the cell body. Another portion of the human nervous system is that you would be able to see this yellowish color item that's along the neuron. This portion here is actually known as the myelin sheath, and this is generally a layer of fatty substance that shields and insulates the nerve fiber. As we are transmitting multiple electrical impulses, this myelin sheath acts as an insulator to retain and to keep the nervous impulses within the neuron and not being lost to the surrounding. So the myelin sheath is generally surrounded by a thin membrane known as the neurulima, and that the end of the motor neuron is actually known as the motor end plate, and this is the junction between the dendrite and the muscle fibers, or where the muscle fibers can be known as the effector. In between, you will see that there is these small gaps. These areas are known as the node of Ranvier, where the myelin sheath is actually absent. So what happens is they tend to speed up the transmission by allowing impulses to jump from one node to another node. Do note that this particular item is not very important for examination. Next, we look at the structure of a sensory neuron. So for the sensory neuron, they tend to transmit nervous impulses from the sense organ to the central nervous system, where your sense organ most probably house your receptors. And the central nervous system can be the brain or the spinal cord. So again, you have similar functionality. However, the only main difference is that it has actually a circular cell body as compared to the motor neuron that has an irregular shaped cell body. The cell body for the sensory neuron also tends to be positioned in between the neuron, whereas the motor neuron tends to position the cell body at the end of the neuron. Okay, they also have, and because of the position of the cell body, it also adjusts the length of the dendron and the axon, where the length of the dendron tends to be longer, as we can see in this position over here, whereas it has a shorter axon. The other portions are actually more or less the same, and it carries the same function just like the motor neuron. So in summary, this is the main difference between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, where the sensory neuron tends to have actually long dendrons and short axons, whereas for motor neuron they tend to have short dendron and long axon. Sensory neuron also be able to detect and conduct impulses generally from the receptors to the central nervous system, while the motor neuron tends to conduct impulses from the central nervous system to the effector. So your receptors are like your sense organ. Your effector tends to be like a muscle group most of the time. Now, what is a synapse? Just like how we saw the different neurons are actually interconnected by one another, the space it have within each other, this particular space, is known as the synapse. And this is where the junction or connection between the two neurons. Now, as we are sending electrical impulses within the neuron, between neuron, so this is called within, and this is called between neurons. So within neuron, the impulses tends to be electrical in nature. Whereas when it's between transmitting information between neurons, it tends to be chemical in nature. Meaning what we see all these dots, right? They are actually known as your neurotransmitter, which are chemical signals that are released so that the information can be sent to the following neurons. Like what we have discussed previously, nerves do not connect by like we do not have just one single strand of nerve connecting to our whole body. Instead, we are actually combined together into a bundle of nerve fibers. And this bundle of nerve fibers tends to be enclosed in a self of connective tissue. So these nerves tend to emerge from the brain, what we call the cranial nerves. Nerves that are emerged from the spinal cord are what we call the spinal nerves. And together, spinal nerves tends to contain mixed fibers, meaning you have different kinds of nerve endings, and they are made up of your sensory and motor nerve fibers. That's why whenever if you have an accident and you break your spine, you tend to have very severe paralysis where you cannot actually move or you cannot even feel anything. However, if your sense organ is actually faulty, you will still be able to move. However, you will have a numbing sensation where you can't feel anything. If let's say your motor neuron is actually severed or damaged, you will still be able to feel because your sensory neuron is still in place. You'll be able to sense pain, but you are not able to respond to the pain through the effector. Okay. Now what we look at is this is actually the spinal cord. So imagine you have your brain. You are actually having a cut in this segment and you are taking a look from here. So this is the side of the brain and therefore you will get this piece here. For the spinal cord, your spinal cord for human tends to be straight, but let's assume that you are lying down, and what will happen is you cut the human in this manner. And if you look at from the bottom angle, you'll be able to see that this is the structure of the spinal cord. Okay. And within the brain and the spinal cord, it should consist two main regions. One is the gray matter and one is the white matter. Where the white matter is the lighter color, it's over here. Should I use it here? Let's say it's green. The white matter over here. The other one is this. So what we can see over here is that for the white matter, they tend to be very of a lighter color, where gray matter tends to be darker. Now, of course, definitely we don't classify it because of the color. Rather, it depends on what is actually contained within those regions. So for the gray matter, the cell bodies of the neurons are actually housed, whereas the white matter, they tend to contain the nerve fibers of the neurons. Okay, the location is just now like how we actually saw. So the spinal cord is basically enclosed in this vertebral column. It's just one whole main like bone structure that actually helps to actually protect the spinal cord, and on top of that it tends to actually be able to branch off. So the spinal cord tends to be there's actually 31 pairs of these spinal nerves, and they emerge at interval along the length of the spinal cord. So each of these position of the spinal nerves, right, they tend to be allocated to different parts of your human body and to control it. Okay. The gray matter of a spinal cord is roughly in the shape of an H. So what we can see over here, and that a narrow central canal containing the cerebral spinal fluid tends to run through the middle of the spinal cord. So each of these spinal cord tends to divide into two main roots. One is known as the dorsal root and the other is known as the ventral root before it joins the spinal cord. So what happens is the dorsal root tends to only contain sensory neuron and the cell body. So this is the region in which the dorsal root is at. So, and on top of that, we can see that we tend not to actually combine the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. So what will happen is that the dorsal root tends to only house the sensory neuron, and you would see that there is actually this bulge over here. This bulge over here is known as the dorsal root ganglion, and that the cell bodies of the sensory neuron are generally clustered together in the dorsal root. The cell bodies of the sensory neurons tend to be clustered together in the dorsal root ganglion. So what you will see a lot of the cell bodies in this position. On the other hand, the gray matter tends to contain mainly the cell bodies of motor and relay neuron. So this is where most of the cell bodies are actually housed there. The vertebral roots, which is the one located at the bottom, here they tend to contain only the motor neuron. So again, you could see that the sensory neuron is housed differently from the motor neuron. And in this case, right, what will happen is, let's say you made an accident, if this portion is actually cut, what will happen is your body will not be able to sense any item, but you will still be able to exhibit a response. However, if let's say it's the other way, where you actually sever your ventral root, that's where all your motor neurons are, you will be able to sense something, but you cannot actually respond or actually to move away from it. So next we look at the spinal cord that contains the nerve fibers from the dorsal root and the ventral root. So this is the one that is important in a sense that if you ever sever this portion here, you will definitely not be able to sense or be able to respond to any changes, because that's where we usually see that you tend to be already fully paralyzed. So the spinal nerve contains the nerve fibers from the dorsal root and ventral root, and generally it slowly divides into the respective parts of the human body. So for nerve impulse transmission, the relay neuron tends to lie within the gray matter of the spinal cord, and it tends to follow this flow, whereby the sensory neuron will tend to be connected to the relay neuron to the brain, and then the brain to the relay neuron to the motor neuron. Okay, so this is the form of relay system, and that relay neurons form the synapse with the sensory and motor neuron, as we can see over here. So how does the nervous system process information? Firstly, information is gathered by the receptors. This information is then converted into electrical signals, which we actually known as the nervous impulses, and is transmitted within the whole nervous system, the nervous neuron. And what happens is these impulses are transmitted to the peripheral nerves. In this case, meaning you have one big nerve, then branching it off to the you have many branches of the nerves moving towards or consolidating into the central nervous system. This will then feed the information to the brain, where it will actually slowly process the information and then sending out the nervous impulses back to the respective neurons, leading to the effector. And once it reaches the effector, there is actually a response being carried out, an action being carried out. Okay, moving on, we will be talking about the reflex action. Should you want to pause the video to recap what you have learned, please do so. Okay.